I want to go back to the inequality point here, because if you look at this biologically, actually, I think it reveals a lot.
This video is about understanding capitalism. But first, Bret Weinstein is going to tell us why our concerns about income inequality are just an illusion.
Why are we, we know from careful study that people are motivated by the degree of inequality more than they are the absolute level of well-being that they have. And there's a very good, it's tragic, but a very good evolutionary reason for this, which is if you are working on some piece of land and your neighbor has the adjacent piece of land and they're doing twice as well as you, it's because they know something you don't, right? And so becoming focused on what they're doing that you're not doing is a rational thing to spend your time on, so you can figure out what it is that they know that you don't. In the modern environment, this is a catastrophe, because who are your neighbors? Well, you've got some box sitting on the wall of your living room that has a totally artificial portrait of other people who may be much wealthier than you, and it's broadcasting in as if you're looking in their window, right, in the adjacent house. And so you think, you're being triggered to think that you're doing something wrong that you might fix, when in fact the solution may not be, first of all, the person on the other side of that screen may not be for real, right. But even if they are, they're not living in the same environment as you. The technology is interfacing with our brains badly. But so we have the perception of massive inequality. Economically, we do have massive inequality. You're arguing that the solution to this involves some sort of massive redistribution.
Well, as solution, I wouldn't argue. Yeah.
But nonetheless, redistribution is wildly unpopular for various reasons. And so what we've got now is a situation, this is speculative, but what's really happening is that austerity is being used as a threat to keep people who would otherwise rebel against the inequality in line. And my fear about this is that this is exactly the conditions that are going to trigger that tribal population against population mayhem that we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation. That when people have the sense that the burst of growth that they were experiencing is now over, the natural response is to turn on those who are not as powerful and take their stuff. That this is a totally indefensible but nonetheless biological pattern of history. And that if we want to avoid that, we have to stop sending the signals that trigger us to imagine that we've just run to the limit of the opportunity that we had discovered, and it is now time to look and see who can't defend their position.
Alright, let's not get too excited here. But what is he excited about? What is the point he is trying to make? The context of this clip is he and Jordan Peterson discussing income inequality on the Joe Rogan podcast. After Peterson made a reference to a UBI, a universal basic income, Bret Weinstein chimed in with his own analysis of income inequality. The argument he is making is that while income inequality is in fact real, it is not necessarily leading to a decline in our standard of living. The real reason people are upset by inequality, according to Weinstein, is that people are more motivated by the perceived inequality than the actual effect it has on them. He attributes this not just to our evolutionary history, but also the media and modern technology. To illustrate, meet Sarah. She is unhappy with the amount of income that is going to the top 1%. According to Weinstein, her discontent is not driven by her difficulty making ends meet, paying her rent, her bills, health insurance, that her neighbor is unemployed, and that she knows a few homeless people, or as Weinstein would say, her absolute well-being. No, according to Weinstein, her discontent stems from her perception that the income inequality is worse than she thinks. This is a rather strange argument, and there are many ways of addressing it. For example, the abundance of statistical evidence demonstrating the exact opposite. However, I think the best way to counter his argument is to let Weinstein do it himself. After ranting on about how people are not actually reacting to a decline in their absolute well-being, and it is all just an illusion, he seems to struggle when asked a very simple question about how this all works.
Sending these signals?
Well, by basically failing to provide enough well-being that people's perception of the inequality is reduced to a tolerable level.
Wait, What did he say in the beginning?
That people are motivated by the degree of inequality more than they are the absolute level of well-being.
Now he's saying.
Failing to provide enough well-being.
Wait a minute.
More than they are the absolute level of well-being.
Do what now?
Failing
Wait.
to provide enough well-being.
What? One more time.
Failing to provide.
Had enough yet? Bret Weinstein can't tell us that on the one hand, people are upset by income inequality because they think it's worse than it is, and not because it is affecting their own well-being. Then on the other hand, say this process is triggered because of a failure to provide them with enough well-being. You can't have it both ways. So let's get this straight. He's saying that society failing to provide people with enough well-being is triggering people to think that, well, society isn't providing them with enough well-being. Wow, great discovery. This argument doesn't seem very well thought out. But I guess it goes without saying that being an expert in biology doesn't mean you're an expert in the social sciences. We could do a lot more to pull apart his arguments and have fun with them. However, that is not the purpose of this video. I didn't fire up my editing software on a Saturday afternoon just to pick on Bret Weinstein. The reason I made this clip is that it makes a great segue into the topic of this video, which is understanding capitalism.
I actually believe that capitalism is the greatest force for prosperity and opportunity the world has ever known. And I believe in private enterprise, not government, but innovators and risk takers and makers and doers.
Entrepreneurship has largely been abandoned as a societal good, and the view of entrepreneurship, which is that it betters everybody. And capitalism is the great altruistic experiment in human history.
If we are serious about understanding capitalism, we have to understand where it came from. This brings us back to medieval Europe. The economic system we had before capitalism was called feudalism. Feudalism was a society set up with multiple ordered classes. The highest class was the king, who owned and ultimately ruled over all the land. Below the king were the nobles, who provided protection and resources for the king in exchange for land. This protection was provided by the knights, in exchange for land provided by the nobles. And at the bottom, we had the serfs. Serfs were required to work on the land provided by the nobles and produce all the resources. To add to this, the serfs were required to work on the land they were born onto and thus serve the noble who owned the land, including paying taxes and obeying their laws. The important thing here is that they didn't have a choice. They couldn't just go and work for a different noble if they thought they could get a better deal. They were stuck. What made this system so rigid is that everyone remains in the class they were born into. A serf will always be a serf, knight always a knight, and nobles always stay a noble. If you were a serf, however, there is one thing you could do. Learn a trade and become a craftsman. Meet Bob. He specializes in making shoes, a specialty that other serfs do not possess. And since the entire town needs to have shoes, he is able to do a bit better for himself. We'll come back and check on Bob a bit later. Wrapped up in all of this was the Catholic Church, who provided justification for these arrangements under the guise that it was commanded by God. By the 13th century, the populations of many feudal societies had grown to the point where they were unable to produce enough to sustain themselves despite the advancements in agricultural technology. In smaller towns, they did not have this problem. They were able to produce more than they needed. For this reason, they started having weekly markets, where the community would go with their extra resources and trade with one another. This gave some people from the more populated areas an idea. They could go to these towns during their markets, buy the resources that are needed back home, and sell them for more than they purchased them for. These people became known as the merchants. This development didn't get the warm welcoming that you'd expect, however. engaging in trade and commerce were seen as sins by the church. This created tensions and often conflicts between the merchants and the other classes, but the contradiction here is that their services were required for the system to function. Fast forward a couple of centuries. Europe is still recovering from the Black Death that occurred a century earlier, which not only wiped out an estimated third of Europe's population, but also dealt a major blow to the position of the kings and nobility. You see, with the kings and nobles having such power extended to them by God, people expected that they'd be able to protect them from outside threats. Having been completely incapable of doing this during the Black Death, people began to not only question the legitimacy of the feudal system, but also the church that provided the ideological framework that held it together. And as a result, the system started to become unstable. By this time, the merchants had managed to amass quite a bit of wealth and status. Many even had trade routes all around the world. This did not stop the conflicts between the merchants and higher classes, however. Only now, the merchants could rally the serfs to fight with them. Eventually, these conflicts would lead to the merchants and serfs overthrowing the kings and nobles altogether in revolutions. In the aftermath of these revolutions, the land that once belonged to the king could now be considered common land for the people to use as they please. This did not last long, however. The merchants, who still had access to wealth and resources, began to claim large lots of land for their own. They then made a deal with the serfs. You can live and work on this land, but everything you produce will belong to me because I own the land and the equipment on it. And in exchange for this, I will give you a predetermined, agreed upon wage that you can use to support yourself. And to sweeten the deal, you would be working at will, meaning you can leave at any time. There will be no more serfdom. Everyone will have liberty, equality, and fraternity. The serfs, having no other choice and seeing this as a great deal compared to how things were before, often agreed to this arrangement. But when they didn't, the merchants would respond with force. Now let's check on our old friend Bob, the shoemaker. Hi, Bob. Since Bob still specializes in his trade, he has no need to work for a wage and is able to continue producing shoes on his own. So now, with kings, queens, and nobles wiped out by the revolutions, and the merchants claiming ownership of the land, we have been reduced to two major classes. Instead of the nobles and the serfs, we have the capitalists and the workers, otherwise known as the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The capitalist, however, needs a way to keep this system going. They could no longer rely on serfdom to keep the workers in line, and they saw firsthand what happens when discontent from the bottom goes unchecked. They handle this by giving the workers some say in how society is run, but not enough to threaten the position of the capitalist. Through this development, we get the modern republics and parliamentary governments, and thus the capitalist system is born. In the early 1700s, an English inventor by the name of Thomas Newcomen discovered that condensed steam could create atmospheric pressure and be used to push a piston into a cylinder. And as a result, we get the steam engine. The invention of the steam engine created a revolution in capitalist production. The use of steam allowed factories to spread further across the landscape, no longer having to rely on water or wind to generate electricity. So how did this affect Bob? Well, he couldn't afford the big machines the capitalists were using, and he was outcompeted. And where he once had his own shop, making and designing shoes, he has now been reduced to standing at a machine for 16 hours a day, pulling levers that make just the insoles. You see, the way capitalist production is organized is that many people work in separate spaces producing a certain part of the product. For example, Bob quits making shoes to start his own factory, making chairs. He hires 2 workers to assemble them. At first, each worker would assemble chairs separately. One employee assembles 1 chair. Then a couple of months later, Bob decides to speed up production to get more per hour out of his workers. He does this by splitting up the tasks. He has one worker assemble the back and front of the chair, and the other puts the two together. By focusing narrowly on fewer tasks, the worker is able to produce more efficiently. This process doesn't stop here, however. Bob continues to split up the tasks to the point where they become so simple that machinery can do more of the work. This is what is referred to as the capitalist division of labor. But what is really happening here is that the workers are losing their connection to the final product and the institution that produced it. This is what we call worker alienation. By the early 1800s, many radical writers began pointing this out, along with the failure of capitalism to deliver on its promises of liberty, equality, and fraternity. One of these writers was, of course, Karl Marx, who not only wrote the Communist Manifesto, but perhaps more importantly, his dissection of the capitalist system, Das Kapital, which is arguably the most influential analysis of capitalism to date. These writings didn't come out of nowhere or in a vacuum, but were rather a reflection of the material conditions that capitalism was creating.
Then home, through the darkening streets, past the vendors calling out the prices of their wares. Veterans of the Crimean War, some blind, others without legs, begging for a penny in the noxious air. The poor smell of London, yeah. Some of my critics, trying to minimize what went into Das Kapital, would say, as they always say about radical writers, oh, he must have had some dreadful personal experience. Yes! If you want to make much of it, that walk home through Soho fueled the anger that went into Das Kapital.
Writings like these provided the insight and influence which marks the next period, known as the Progressive Era. In this era, we saw militant and organized labor unions that fought for important reforms, such as an 8-hour working day and outlawing child labor. Fast forward a couple of decades to the 1920s. Capitalism has by now expanded across the globe and become interdependent. But by the late 20s, early 30s, this system collapsed. While the reasons for this collapse may vary depending on who you're talking to, one thing should be universally recognized: that income inequality played a major role. To deny this would be no better than Bret Weinstein insisting that it is all just an illusion. In fact, inequality is a fundamental part to how capitalism works. So how does capitalism produce inequality, and why is it a problem? When a capitalist hires a worker, let's say our old friend Bob, to make shoes, he pays him, let's say, $15 an hour. And in that hour, he produces $30 worth of product. The extra 15 is what we call the surplus. The capitalist takes the 15, puts 5 towards rent and other expenses, and with the remaining 10, either keeps his profit or invests it back into his company. But the one thing that doesn't happen is Bob does not get a say in how the surplus is used. This is because in capitalist production, Bob does not own what he produces, the capitalist does. Multiply this by the 300 workers employed by the capitalist, and we can see how large sums of income can go into so few hands. This is accelerated when a combination of market competition and a desire to maximize profit brings the capitalist to seek an increase in the surplus. This can only be done by reducing the amount that goes to the worker. There are many problems that this creates, but the one that I like to focus on now is that in doing this, the capitalist is ultimately accumulating. But what is he accumulating? Well, product, in this case, shoes, which he expects at some point will be sold to the public. Thus, the success of his business is contingent on the public's ability to purchase these shoes. Well, this is where we have the problem. If there is a constant drive for the capitalists to reduce wages, then what does that do for their ability to sell products?
How much for beer?
$1.50.
$1.50? Good Lord, that's a lot of money for beer. How much for light beer?
150.
150? Good Lord, that don't sound too light to me. Why don't you bring out the dirty bar rag in my mouth? Yeah.
So the desire of the capitalist to maximize profit for short-term gain is in direct contradiction to the bigger picture. This is one example of what Marx referred to as an internal contradiction of capitalism. So this inequality leads to instability, crisis, and in this case, the Great Depression. With the instability of capitalism, we get the instability of the governments that support it. During the Great Depression, we saw fascist regimes pop up all over the world. In one country, Germany, the effects of the Great Depression hit the people pretty hard. They faced a massive inflation, industrial production tanked, and skyrocketing unemployment followed. With the government incapable of doing its job, that is, holding the system together, many had turned to the Communist Party of Germany, who were seeking to overthrow capitalism. However, they weren't the only place that people were turning. You see, when capitalism stops working, it is quite reasonable for people to ask why. Some might find these people.
There are multiplied thousands of others who, like myself, have come to realize that before we may truly enjoy the blessings of civilized life, we must organize and reorganize society upon a mutual and cooperative basis. I never so clearly comprehended as now the great struggle between the powers of greed and exploitation on the one hand, and upon the other, the rising hosts of industrial freedom and social justice.
Others might find people like this.
If you ask what we are actively fighting for under our charter, first, a social just white Gentile ruled United States. Second, Gentile-controlled labor union, free from Jewish Moscow-directed domination.
In the case of Germany, Hitler and the Nazi Party had easier access to the government and even enjoyed the support of some key capitalists. And the rest is, well, history. In the United States, this situation was handled differently. The president at the time, FDR, was a rich capitalist himself. So perhaps that's why he saw the amount of well-organized socialist and labor unions at the time and understood this to be a threat to the capitalist system. But rather than supporting some authoritarian agenda to put them in line, he decided to make a deal with them. He increased the social safety net through unemployment insurance, Social Security, a jobs program, and many other things. And on top of this, he made it easier for workers to form a union and instituted a series of regulations in order to prevent another Great Depression. And we all know what increased regulations lead to.
I had to open a lemonade stand right outside my studio here. Lemonade for sale.
I failed. I tried to follow my government's rules, but they were endless. The government said I had to take a 15-hour food protection class. To sell lemonade? After this, there's an exam. Then I have to wait weeks to find out if I passed. And if I did, I'd have to buy a government-approved fire extinguisher.
I got my fire extinguisher.
No, not exactly. Actually, quite the opposite. Things were booming. This era is even referred to as the golden age of capitalism, marked by an increasing middle class, shared prosperity, increases in home ownership, and the ability to raise a family on one income. This was made possible in part because a high percentage of the workforce was represented by unions, which meant that they could bargain for a larger share of their productivity. What this did is that Bob can now produce $50 worth of product instead of $30 due to an upgrade in the company's equipment. With the power of his union supporting him, he could bargain to get, let's say, $25 an hour, and the capitalist can keep the other 10. So let's take a step back and see how this is affecting the bigger picture. When the workers become more productive, they receive more in pay, which enables them to spend more, which increases the demand for the products, and inevitably leads to an increase in productivity. And this process repeats so long as the capitalist continues paying the workers more. And as you can see, this is exactly how the economy worked. That is, until around 1975. So what happened? Well, in the background, since these reforms were passed in 1936, the capitalist system went to work to undermine them. The capitalists used the power and influence they had on the government to chip away at the regulations that stood in their way of profit, and the Cold War narrative which scared people away from joining unions and organizing with socialists. In doing this, they were able to undermine both the New Deal and the forces that made it possible, and rapid income inequality once again took off, with all the social consequences that come with it.
As through a glance, darkly you seek yourself, but the light grows weak under Yggdrasil. A basket of eggs, where you count your days, though your gut lies failed, only shells remain. I can tell you've been drinking by the scent of your breath. Another little sip, a bit deeper and dead. You can rest your head in your wrinkled hands, but when you awake, you're in another land.
So if capitalism is dependent on the public's ability to purchase the goods and services they produce, how has it been able to survive through all this inequality without falling into another major depression? Well, the capitalists got creative. Instead of paying the workers more for their productivity, they could just lend it to them. So instead of increasing wages dipping into their profits, they began lending it to them at an interest rate, which has the convenient effect of increasing their profits even more. So through credit cards, auto loans, student loans, and mortgages, household debt took off to a level that this country had never seen before. However, this wasn't the end of the downward pressure on wages. You see, with the capitalist system becoming increasingly globalized, there are still many parts of the world that haven't experienced the labor reforms of the more developed countries. This means that in some parts of the world, workers can be paid just pennies a day. This leads the capitalists to use the power and influence they have over the government to push for trade deals, making it easier for them to move their operations to less developed countries, many of which hadn't even outlawed child labor. What this does is put workers in more developed countries in direct competition with workers in the third world, making a fraction of what they do. Doing this makes it more difficult for them to bargain for higher wages. Other capitalists, however, found a much more lucrative way of making profit. They began purchasing assets with the hopes of there being a rapid increase in its market price and then selling it at a profit. This is what is referred to as market speculation. But with wealth concentrated into so few hands, this speculation often leads to asset prices becoming inflated far beyond their market value. This is what is called an asset bubble, and like all bubbles, they ultimately burst. You see, by artificially inflating market prices, the capitalist has once again created a situation where the public can no longer afford to purchase what is being produced. The end result being market prices falling back down to their previous level, and all the wealth that was created disappears. So these bubbles are ultimately the result of inequality. This was the basic story behind the tech and dot-com bubbles of the 90s and the housing bubble of the early 2000s. The housing bubble, though, is worth taking a closer look at. For roughly 100 years, housing prices mostly kept pace with the rate of inflation. But in the late 90s, housing prices began to take off, accumulating in a bubble of $8 trillion by the year 2007. However, it isn't the size of the housing bubble that makes it stand out. For one, this run-up in prices led to an increase in real estate construction, providing real jobs with real incomes for working-class Americans, many of whom own the homes that were increasing in value. And with the politicians in the media saying things like this,
Ben, there's been a lot of talk about a housing bubble, particularly, from the Fed, from all sorts of different places. Can you give us your view as to whether or not there is a housing bubble out there?
Well, unquestionably, housing prices are up quite a bit. I think it's important to note that fundamentals are also very strong. We've got a growing economy, jobs, incomes. We've got very low mortgage rates. We've got demographics supporting housing growth. We've got restricted supply in some places. So it's certainly understandable that prices would go up some. I don't know whether prices are exactly where they should be, but I think it's fair to say that much of what's happened is supported by the strength of the economy.
It should be no surprise that people thought the increasing equity in their homes was here to stay. So naturally, they began taking out loans and spending against it. Now let's remember, this economy is reliant on the public having money to purchase products. Well, once the bubble burst in 2008, all of this came crashing down, and the economy lost $8 trillion to spend on products, leading to mass unemployment, bankruptcies, foreclosures, and homelessness. But don't worry, the government moved swiftly to take care of all this by, bailing out the banks. I mean, come on, they had priorities. This isn't to say that some attempts weren't made to get the rest of the public back on track. But what is reflected today, despite all the media hype about the booming economy, is that the financial sector has been doing great, but we still have millions of people looking for work. And how are we doing with inequality, by the way? Well, here is a productivity chart. The top line represents the value of the goods and services produced, and the bottom line is the amount paid in wages to produce them. And of course, everything in between is the surplus. That's quite a gap. Indeed, income inequality has reached a point that we haven't seen since before the Great Depression. And on a global scale, just 8 people own more wealth than the bottom half of the world's population. That's 3.6 billion people. Are these 8 people more productive than 3.5 billion? Or is the system doing a terrible job with allocating resources? I'll let you decide, but just keep in mind we have over $1 trillion of idle equipment just sitting there, along with an infrastructure in desperate need of repairs. And on top of this, we have record homelessness with a record amount of vacant homes. These seem like fairly straightforward issues to address, yet this capitalist system can't figure out how to put them together. Now I know what you're thinking. This isn't real capitalism, it's crony capitalism. The government ensuring favorable market conditions for some businesses and not others. Well, I acknowledge the existence of crony capitalism, but I just call it by its short name, capitalism. There's no reason to think that going back to the unregulated capitalism of the 19th century wouldn't just produce the same results we have now. What some are calling crony capitalism, to me just seems like the natural development of the capitalist system. Besides, markets and free enterprise are not unique to capitalism. What is unique to capitalism is the existence of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, one producing the resources and the other owning those resources. The degree to which the government is involved in this process is irrelevant. The government can even take over an entire industry, or if you'd like, the entire economy. It still doesn't fundamentally alter this relationship. The state has just taken over the role of the capitalist. Many even refer to this as state capitalism. So if regulation, or even having the government run the economy isn't the answer, then what is? How can we have a system that doesn't produce this inequality? Well, I'm glad that you asked. An alternative would be rather than having one class produce for another to own, we could have those who produce own what they are producing. This would mean having the workers own the businesses they are working in. Organizing production in this way would not only reduce inequality, but by spreading out the decision-making process to more people, the businesses would act in a more socially responsible manner. This isn't just some utopian fantasy of mine. These businesses exist today and are known as worker cooperatives. There are over 300 of them in the United States alone, employing thousands of people. In fact, the 10th largest business in Spain, the Mondragon Corporation, is a worker cooperative, employing over 70,000 people and generating over $10 billion in annual revenues. Recent studies have even shown that worker cooperatives have more equal incomes, their employees are happier, they are more productive, and better apt at surviving recessions. So while they might not fit perfectly into a break from the capitalist system, they give us a glimpse of what an alternative system of production might look like. There is no denying that industrial capitalism has accomplished a lot in its roughly 300 years of existence. But this same system that has expanded life expectancy, allowed us to travel and communicate around the globe, and enabled us to produce far beyond our needs, has also set us into a collision course with environmental catastrophe and impending nuclear conflict. But since the crash of 2008, the anemic recovery, and the rise of white supremacists, people are once again coming out searching for an alternative. It is my hope that while we are in the streets fighting against the injustices that capitalism creates, that those who are building worker cooperatives might be to capitalism what the merchants were to feudalism. But by now, we don't have centuries to spare. In times like these, we can't afford to allow the conversations around capitalism to be reduced by ideologues who have no intentions of making a serious assessment. But rather we should be looking at the accomplishments of capitalism while also being honest about its flaws. In this, millions of people are drawing the same conclusion. We need a new system. And on that note, thank you for watching, and as always, solidarity.
Solidarity.